3 princesses, each 3 meters tall, dozens of elves in armor, and everyone is staring at a single little man who has just criticized their princess's boots. Corny's prophecy has come true. The little stranger has arrived from beyond the border. Except he has no idea what prophecy they're talking about. Danny Park opens his eyes and stares at a knee, a massive knee in a boot made of silvery bark, higher than his head. He isn't lying on the floor, he's lying on roots, and the roots are shifting beneath his back like the fingers of a sleeping giant. He crawls upward with his gaze, a thigh, a belt with a dagger as long as his arm, armor with a lunar pattern, chest, neck, and only then the face. Pale gold skin, white hair down to the waist, ears as long as a palm, and eyes the color of cold silver that pierce him as if he had just fallen out of a legend right at her feet. 2 more stand behind her, one in red, one in black. All 3 taller than any person he's ever seen in his life. The tallest one in red, over 3 meters, shoulders wider than a doorway. She utters a few words in a language he shouldn't understand, but he does. She says it's him, that the sisters must take a look, that it really is him. Danny wants to apologize and say he must have walked into the wrong place, but his parched mouth betrays something entirely different. He says her boots are split right down the seam and asks if it's the leather's fault or the craftsman's. The princess in red blinks, once, then slowly drops to one knee. And even on one knee, she still towers over him. She demands he repeat it, slowly, and now look around with him. The hall is enormous. The ceiling is lost in green twilight. Columns of living wood surge upward and intertwine their crowns. Between them hang lamps the size of barrels. The floor beneath Danny is warm and breathes. Literally breathes. He feels it with his back. Slow tremors, like a pulse. Behind the giantesses stand dozens of elves, all of them huge, all in armor or robes, all staring intently at the little man, 5'9", who is sprawled on the roots in the middle of their council hall and has just smashed their princess's boots to pieces. Danny sits down. His head is spinning. The last thing he remembers: rain, headlights, wet asphalt, the edge of a dresser in the rearview mirror. Then the impact. Then light. Too soft and too green for a crash. And now he's here. The one in white crouches down beside him, slowly, like someone sitting next to a wounded animal so as not to scare it away. She smells like moonflowers. Her voice sounds like a cello in the lower register. She asks if he knows where he is. Danny scans the living columns, the ceiling of tree crowns, the lamps made of bark, the floor of roots, 3-meter-tall creatures with pointed ears. He answers that he doesn't, but that their floor is amazing. Elm, or something very much like an elm, only alive. The 3rd princess in black hasn't moved since he arrived. She stands motionless. Her face is like a mask. Her coal-black hair reaches the ground. Her eyes are as dark as the bottom of a well. She is silent. She just stares. And that gaze makes Danny feel uneasy. Not fear, recognition, as if she had been waiting for him for a long time. The one in red rises from her knees. The floor shudders. She turns toward the hall and speaks so that everyone can hear. Corny's prophecy has come true. The small stranger from beyond the border stands before them, and he looks at their world through the eyes of a craftsman. The hall buzzes. Danny catches several glances. Not all of them are kind. A gray-haired elf in the 3rd row. The face of a kind old man, taller than the rest, over 6 feet. He eyes Danny like a cockroach that has crawled onto the banquet table, calmly, with mild disgust. and with calculation. Danny doesn't like that look. The one in white covers his hand entirely with her palm, like a glove on a child's hand. She introduces herself. Iselin Sylvandir, princess of the Moon House. The one in red pounds her fist against her breastplate, apparently a greeting. Kayla Karan, princess of the Sun House, commander of the Scarlet Guard. The one in black silently bows her head, by a single degree. Morwen Tanavel, princess of the Shadow House, ritualist. 3 princesses, 3 houses, and him. Danny Park, a cabinet maker from Portland who, 6 hours ago, was delivering a dresser to a client and got hit by a truck. Kayla demands his name. He gives it. She tries to repeat it. It turns out something between Danny and a bear's growl. She decides she'll call him Baby. Danny wants to object. He looks up at her, then up again, and decides that arguing with a 6-foot-tall woman in battle armor 2 minutes into their acquaintance is a bad survival strategy. He down a 4-meter-high corridor. The doors are even higher. Torches burn at the height of his living room ceiling back in Portland. He walks between Iselin and Kayla. The tops of their heads reach his thighs. Morwen glides behind him, silently. He doesn't hear her footsteps, but feels her against his back, like a draft, like a shadow. They lead him into the guest room, a bed the size of his living room, a chair that reaches his chest, a water bowl like a wash basin. Danny looks at the bed, at the chair, at the bowl, and sits right on the floor. Because the floor is the only thing in this room that fits him. Iselin notices this. Something flashes in her silver eyes. Not pity, shame. She says they'll talk in the morning, that he needs to rest, that he's safe. Kayla adds that guards will stand at the door. 2 Red Guard fighters. Anyone who sneaks in without permission will end up a head shorter. She says this with a smile, but her eyes don't smile. Morwen says nothing. She stands in the doorway for a couple more seconds. Then she leaves. The door closes. Heavy, wooden, with hinges as thick as his wrist. Danny is left alone. He sits on the warm living floor in the giant's room, in a world that cannot exist, with 3 3-meter-tall princesses behind the wall, with a prophecy he doesn't understand, and with the hands of a restorer that still smell of varnish and fish glue. He examines his palms. Calluses from the chisel. A scar from the plane on his left index finger. Grain lines etched into his skin from 5 years of work. Then he shifts his gaze to the wall. Living wood. Warm. He reaches out and touches it. And freezes. He feels it. Under the bark. Deep. Very deep. Something is wrong. The tree is in pain. He doesn't know where this thought comes from, but his hands know. Hands always know before the head does. His grandfather used to tell him that. His head argues. His hands remember. Danny pulls his hand away from the wall. He lies down on the floor. The warm roots beneath his back pulsate. Slowly, like a sick heart, he closes his eyes. Behind the wall, the heavy footsteps of the guards thunder. Somewhere far away, music plays. String music. Sad. The first night in the world of the high forests. Danny Park's first night in a Lorien. Morning came with the scent of pine needles and honey. Danny opened his eyes. He was still lying on the floor. His back ached, but the floor was warm and pulsed softly beneath him. It was almost soothing. The light in the room didn't come from the window. It came from the walls. The living tree glowed from within, softly, greenish, like a ray of dawn through a leaf. Danny sat up and looked around. Everything was just as huge as it had been yesterday. The bed living room, the chair fortress, the bowl wash basin. A tray stood on the floor next to him. Someone had brought food while he slept. On the tray was a plate the size of his dinner plate at home. There was fruit on the plate. Each piece was the size of his fist, and a piece of bread, or rather, a piece of something that looked like bread. He took a bite. It tasted nutty, dense, good. A cup stood next to the tray. Danny picked it up with both hands. He took a sip. Something herbal and sweet. He ate while sitting on the floor of the giant room, legs crossed, like a picnic. The door opened without a knock. Kayla, 6 feet 3 inches in full morning armor, a scarlet cloak, copper hair pulled back into a tight knot. She entered and stopped. She looked down. He was sitting on the floor, eating. Something flickered across her face. She said that today the Council of the Three Houses would make a decision regarding his status. The prophecy had been announced. Now formal confirmation was needed. Danny asked what formal confirmation meant. Kayla crouched down in front of him. Even so, she looked down on him. She explained. The prophecy of the corns speaks of a small stranger, of the craft of a foreign son, of 3 crowned sisters who, with his fate, 3 princesses, 3 houses, he is the one. Danny blinked. He asked what bind their fate meant. Kayla smiled, widely. She said one word, betrothed. Danny set the cup down on the floor, very carefully, with both hands. He asked, betrothed? In what sense? Kayla laughed. Her laughter bounced off the walls like the toll of a bell. She said, literally, in the only possible sense, that the 3 princesses of the 3 houses had been declared his brides by right of the prophecy, that it was not up for discussion. That was what the ancestors had decided. Danny sat in silence. Then he stood up. The top of his head was level with her chest, even when she was crouching. He said that in his culture, betrothed usually meant a dialogue, not a decision made by the elders. Kayla tilted her head. She asked what dialogue meant in this context. Danny said that usually both people get to know each other first. Then they get to know each other better. Then they decide together. Kayla was silent for a second. Then she said that it sounded inefficient, but funny, and that she agreed to try it. Then she stood up to her full height. Danny tilted his head back. She held out her hand to him. Her palm was like a shovel. Danny placed his hand in hers. His hand sank into it. Kayla led him into the council chamber. On the way, they passed through a corridor lined with guards, all over 2.5 meters tall, all in crimson armor, all staring at him. One of them said something to another, quietly. Danny didn't catch it, but he could tell from Kayla's face that she had. She stopped, turned to the guard. He was a head shorter than her. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him. The guard turned pale and stood at attention. Kayla walked on. Danny walked beside her, or rather, beside her foot. The council hall looked different in daylight. Light streamed in from above, through the treetops, green and gold. Columns of living wood soared upward. Banners hung between them, a silver one with a moon for Sylvandir, a scarlet one with a sun for Keren, a black one with a root for Tenevel. The lords of the 3 houses were already seated at the long table. The table was at his chin level. The chairs were taller than his head. Iselin was already there. In a moon-white dress, she sat at the head of the table on the Sylvandir side. She saw Danny and nodded to him, casually, like an old acquaintance. Morwen sat at the far end, in black, motionless, staring straight ahead. But when Danny entered, she turned her head slightly, just a degree. Kayla led him to the table. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. The chair came up to her waist, to the top of his head. Without a word, Kayla lifted him with one hand and sat him down on the chair, like a child in a high chair. Danny sat in the chair, his feet not reaching the floor. The hall was full. Dozens of elven lords, all of them huge, all of them staring at the little man in the big chair with his legs dangling. One of the lords of Sylvandir stood up. He began to speak, at length, ritualistically, about the prophecy of the roots, about the illness of the ancestral tree, about signs and omens. Danny understood every word. It was strange. The language was neither English nor Korean, but the meaning went straight into his head, as if the roots beneath the floor were translating for him. The Lord spoke of how the tree was weakening, how the silver in the blood of young elves was thinning, how the growth of new generations was declining, how the birth rate was falling, that if nothing changed, in 3 generations the elves of Elorian would disappear. Danny listened. It didn't sound like a fairy tale. It sounded like a diagnosis. Then that same elf stood up, gray-haired, 324, the face of a kind old man. He was introduced, Lord Velcor Tenevel, High Ritualist of the House of Shadows, Morven's second cousin. Velcore spoke softly, respectfully. He said that the prophecy was sacred, that no one dared to dispute it, but that they must be certain. After all, who knows who might fall out of nowhere onto the floor of the council hall? He proposed a test. Let the stranger prove that he masters the craft of a foreign sun. Let him repair what the elves could not. The hall hummed with approval. Danny looked at Velcore. Velcore looked at Danny and smiled, warmly, like a grandfather. But his eyes were like 2 stones at the bottom of a cold river. Iselin stood up. She said she had what was needed, and asked for the first queen's lute to be brought. The hall fell silent. A whisper ran through the rows. One of the lords of Sylvandir said that the instrument was dead, that the ritualists had confirmed this 100 years ago, that the wood had decided to leave. Iselin replied calmly. She said that this was precisely the test. 2 guards carried in the case, long, over a meter, made of dark wood with silver inlays. They placed it on the table in front of Danny. Iselin unlocked the case. Inside lay the lute, huge by human standards, the size of a cello. The body was made of wood Danny had never seen before, reddish with golden veins. The neck was long, slender, carved. There was a crack on the soundboard, a long one, from the lower nut to the rosette. Danny reached out. His fingers touched the wood, and he felt it. Not magic, wood. His hands knew before his head did. The moisture, the grain, the age, the species, and the crack. He ran his finger along it, slowly. The hall fell silent. Everyone watched as the little man ran his finger along the dead instrument. Danny withdrew his hand. He said the lute wasn't dead. It was tired. The back had lost its tension. The wood hadn't gone bad. It had sagged. The difference was roughly the same as between a dead person and a sleeping one. The hall was silent. Velcore narrowed his eyes slightly.
Danny said he needed 3 days. A piece of spruce for the soundboard, fish glue, which they most likely didn't have, but he'd show them how to make it from fish scales, and a clamp, which they didn't have either, but he'd draw a sketch and someone would knock one together. Iselin was watching him. Silver eyes. Something in them was changing. Something warm. Kayla slammed her fist on the table. The table shook. She said they would give the stranger everything he asked for, and that if any of the lords had objections, she would be happy to discuss them on the training grounds. There were no objections. They gave him a workshop that very day. Or rather, not a workshop, a storage room. An old storage room of House Sylvandir on the lower level of the palace, near the roots. The ceiling was lower than in the other halls, just 3 meters. For elves, it was cramped. For Danny, it was almost normal. Almost. The workbench stood at chest height, The shelves began above his head. He could only open the door by jumping up to reach the handle. But it smelled of wood in here. Living wood, resin, wood shavings that no one had cleaned up in years. And silence. The kind of silence perfect for work. Danny ran his hand along the wall. The same roots, the same pulse. Only down here it was more distinct, as if he were standing closer to the heart of something enormous. First thing he did, he asked for wood for a scaffold. 3 planks. Iselin gave the order, and an hour later, 2 guards brought in logs, each as thick as his torso. Danny looked at them, looked at the guards. The guards looked at him. He asked for something smaller. The guards exchanged glances. To them, that was small. Then Tally Stonebird appeared in the doorway, 5 feet 8 inches tall, red-haired, freckled, hands covered in soot up to the elbows. She was a dwarf, a blacksmith, ambassador of the Hilltop Guild to the court of Sylvandir. She looked at Danny, looked at the logs, and said that apparently she was the only one here who had to solve problems of normal size. She left and returned 2 hours later with a set of planks. Normal ones, human-sized. She'd found them from merchants in the port district. Danny held out his hand. She shook it, firmly. She said her name was Tally, and that if he was going to work with wood in this world, he needed normal tools, not elven chisels the size of an oar. Danny pulled out a sheet of paper, or rather, a piece of bark. Paper didn't come in its usual form here either. He'd drawn up the plans. A chisel, a plane, a carving knife, a clamp. Everything to fit his hand, to his height, with exact measurements. Tally looked at the drawings. She was silent. Then she said he was serious, that this was a real order. With drawings, with measurements, with a bow. Danny didn't bow, but she apparently took his respect as a bow. She said that if he bowed to a gnome one more time, she'd hit him with a hammer. That's an insult to them. Then she took the blueprints and left. From that moment on, they started working together. Tally forged, Danny built. On the first day, he built scaffolding along the workbench, a ladder to the shelves, a step to the door. On the second day, he assembled a drying rack. He found fish scales from the gnome merchants. He boiled glue in a pot that Tally had brought from the embassy kitchen. The smell was monstrous. The guards at the doors winced. One of the guards asked if the stranger was trying to poison the palace. Tally answered him briefly and obscenely. On the third day, he set to work on the loot. He shut himself in the workshop alone. The loot lay before him on the workbench. Huge, beautiful, ailing. He ran his fingers along the crack, slowly, as if tracing a scar. The wood beneath his fingers was dry and brittle at the edges of the crack. But deeper, 2 centimeters from the surface, it was alive, moist, warm. The soundboard had sagged, lost its tension. After 100 years without being played, the wood had grown accustomed to silence. It had shrunk, closed in on itself. Like a person who hadn't spoken for too long and had forgotten the sound of their own voice. Danny worked all day. He removed the old strings, carefully, one by one. Each was as thick as his little finger. He smoothed the edges of the crack, finely, to the fraction of a millimeter. He carved a wedge from the spruce soundboard. The spruce here was different, denser, more resonant. The grain ran straighter than in any spruce he'd seen on Earth. He fitted the wedge into the crack. He didn't just plug it. He placed it under the old top so that it gently lifted it from the inside, restoring the tension, like a pillow under a tired back. Then he poured in fish glue, clamped it down with a clamp, and waited. He sat next to the lute and waited for the glue to set. No one came into the workshop. Iselin sent food with a note on birch bark. The note was in Elvish. He understood every word. She wrote that she believed in him and that if he needed more time, she would postpone the council meeting.
Danny smiled. For the first time in 3 days. In the evening, Morwen came, without knocking, without a sound. He turned around and she was already in the workshop, standing in the corner, black hair, a motionless face. She didn't say anything. She just watched him work. Danny worked under her gaze for a while. Then he asked if she wanted to sit down. Morwen looked around. There was only one chair, his size, small by her standards. She sat down on the floor in silence, crossed her legs. Even sitting on the floor, she was the same height as him. They sat side by side, in silence. He worked, she watched. An hour later, she left, just as silently as she had come. She stopped only at the door and said one word, quietly, almost a whisper. She said, "Thank you." Danny didn't understand what for, but he didn't ask. On the fourth morning, he removed the clamp. He ran his finger over the joint. Smooth, even. There had been a crack. Now it was gone. Or rather, it was still there, but it had become part of the instrument. Not a wound, but a scar that made it stronger. He strung it up. New strings, made from the sinew Tally had brought. He tuned it. He plucked the first string. The sound. Deep, pure, warm. Like the voice of a man who finally spoke after a long silence. Danny closed his eyes. His hands had done their work. He carried the lute into the council chamber. It was heavy to carry. It was almost as tall as he was. He held it close with both hands and walked slowly. The guards in the corridor turned to look. Everyone had already gathered in the hall. The 3 princesses, the lords of the 3 houses. Velcor in the 3rd row, with the face of a kind grandfather. Danny approached the table. The table came up to his chin. He placed the lute on the table. He turned to Iselin and said it was ready. Iselin stood up, 6 feet tall. She approached the table. Her hands trembled, just a little. She took the lute, as if by habit, as one takes what one remembers with one's whole body. She pressed it to herself, touched the strings, and the lute began to sing. Not like before, better than before. The sound filled the hall, bounced off the living columns, faded into the treetops, returned as a soft echo. Danny stood and watched Iselin. She was playing, her eyes closed, her lips slightly parted. A trail glistened on her cheek. She was crying, not from sadness, from the fact that her favorite thing was speaking to her again. The hall was silent, complete silence. Even Velcor was silent. Kayla quietly said that the prophecy does not lie, that it repairs what they bury. Iselin finished playing. She opened her eyes. She looked down at Danny, from a height of 3 meters and 2 centimeters, and she said 2 words. She said, "Thank you, master." Danny replied that he wasn't a master, that he had simply listened to what she needed. The hall was silent for another second. Then Kayla stood up and slammed her fist on the table. She said that Danny Park was recognized as the little one from the prophecy of the corns, that from this day forward, he was under the protection of all 3 houses, that his hands were sacred. The lords rose one by one. It was a vote, or something like that. Almost everyone stood. Almost. Though Corey rose last. Slowly, with a smile. A warm one. A fatherly one. And he bowed to Danny. Low. Gracefully. And Danny suddenly realized that this bow was more dangerous than a knife wound. Because now Velcori had shown everyone that he respected the stranger. And when the stranger died in an accident, no one think of the good old lord. Danny spent the first week after his confession in the workshop. He worked. He built. He was remodeling the space to suit himself. Tally brought tools based on his drawings. Chisels, a plane, a carving knife, 3 types of whetstones. Every item was forged to fit his hand perfectly. When he picked up the first chisel and ran his finger along the blade, Tally stood nearby and waited. He said it was perfect. She replied that, of course it was perfect. She forged. Everything she forges is perfect. And if he said otherwise, she'd hit him with that very chisel. The workshop was filling up. Danny built a shelf for the tools, a second workbench below the first, a drying rack, a system of ropes and pulleys to lift heavy workpieces onto the workbench without help. The elves watched with curiosity, some with disdain. To them, it was strange. They grew things from living wood using silver. Why saw? Why plane? Why glue? The wood takes the desired shape on its own if you ask it properly. Danny didn't know how to ask. He didn't have silver in his blood. Magic didn't respond to his fingers. He could only cut, plane, sand, glue. Do with his hands what the elves did with their will. And that was exactly why he saw what they didn't. Iselin came every day, in the morning, with a cup of some herbal tea. She sat down on his little stool. Her knees rose almost to her chin. She looked ridiculous, and she didn't care. She brought work. On the first day, it was a comb for her younger sister, whose hair was tangled. Elve's hair was special, thin as a spiderweb, long, down to the ground for some. Ordinary combs broke it. Danny asked what kind of hair her sister had, fine or medium, straight or wavy. Did it tangle at the roots or in the middle? Iselin froze. Then she answered in detail. Danny made the comb in 2 days, out of light wood, with teeth of varying spacing, sparse at the base, dense toward the ends. He rounded and polished each tooth to a smoothness that elven combs lacked, because elven combs were carved from wood, and wood that's been carved isn't as smooth as sanded wood. Iselin took the comb. She ran her finger along the teeth. She looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears. She said that no one had ever asked what her sister's hair was like. Everyone made combs for Princess Sylvandir. No one made them for a specific person. Danny shrugged and said that his grandfather had taught him otherwise. A chair isn't for a task, but for a specific butt. Iselin laughed, quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. Kayla came differently. Not every day, but when she did come, she took up the whole workshop. 6 feet 3 inches, scarlet armor, broad shoulders. She sat right on the floor, spread her legs, and talked about training, about the guards, about how one recruit tried to lift her training sword and couldn't. She laughed, loudly. The walls vibrated. Danny worked and listened. Once she fell silent. He turned around. Kayla was looking at her sword, huge, 1.5-handed, the hilt wrapped in leather, standard. The same for all Red Guard commanders. Danny asked what was wrong. Kayla said the hilt was slippery, that she'd rewrapped it 3 times, that the leather wouldn't hold, that her hand was too big, even by elven standards, and the standard wrapping didn't fit her. She said it simply, like a fact, but Danny heard more. He heard that her whole life she'd been given weapons meant for someone average, and she wasn't average. She was the biggest, the strongest, the greatest, and no one had ever adjusted anything for her. Danny said, "Give it to me." Kayla held out the sword. It weighed as much as half of Danny. He set it on the workbench, removed the old grip, measured the hilt, then asked Kayla to place her hand on the workbench. She did. Her palm was wider than his workbench. He measured it. Every finger, every crease, the distance between the knuckles, the angle of the grip. Kayla watched in silence. No one had ever measured her hand. Never. She was the house's weapon. She was taught to win. No one cared whether it was comfortable for her to hold the thing with which she won. Danny worked for 3 days. He carved the handle from black wood that Tally had found among the merchants. Hard, dense, with indentations perfectly shaped for Kayla's fingers. Every curve mirrored the contour of her hand. On the inside, where no one would see it, he carved a small brand, the letter K. Kayla came for the sword on the 4th day. She took it, gripped the hilt. Her fingers slid into the indentations like a key into a lock. She froze, turned the hilt, saw the mark. Danny waited. Kayla stood there, 6 feet 3 inches, the greatest warrior of her generation, commander of the Scarlet Guard, princess of the House of the Sun. She held the sword and wept. For the first time in public, tears rolled down her cheeks, big ones, like grapes. Then she laughed through her tears. She bent down, lifted Danny with one hand, easily, like lifting a cat. She pressed him against her breastplate. The armor was cold and hard, but her hand was warm. She said he would live a long life. That she would see to it. Danny hung 2 meters in the air in the embrace of a 3-meter-tall warrior. His legs dangled in the air. His ribs creaked. The armor pressed against him. He said he was grateful, but if she squeezed any tighter, he wouldn't live long. Kayla loosened her grip. She set him down on the floor. She ruffled his hair. Her palm covered the top of his head. And she left, with a new hilt, with tears on her cheeks, with a smile. Morwen came at night, always at night, silently. He'd turn around and she'd already be sitting in the corner, on the floor, silently, watching. For the first 3 nights, Danny just worked while she was there. She didn't interfere. She didn't speak. She was just there. On the 4th night, he asked if she came because that was the custom in her house. Morwen was silent. Then she said yes. In House Tenevel, they court with silence and presence. To come and be there means I want you to know that I am here. Danny nodded. He said he understood, and that he liked it, that he felt calmer with her in the workshop. Morwen didn't reply, but the next night she came earlier. On the 10th day, Danny nearly died. He was standing on the balcony of the upper tier of the Sylvandir Palace. The balcony was 30 meters above the roots. The railing came up to his chest. For elves, it was knee-high. Below stretched the treetops, glowing, green, beautiful. He had gone out to get some air. The workshop smelled of glue and wood shavings. Sometimes he needed fresh air. The fresh air here was different, thick, slightly sweet, with a hint of something alive. Danny stood and looked down, and heard a footstep. One, behind him. He turned around. An elf. Tall. 6 feet 2 or so. Black clothes. Face covered by a mask of dark bark. A knife in his hand. Long. Thin. More like a dagger. The elf moved fast. Very fast. Faster than any human Danny had ever seen. The knife was heading for his throat. Danny didn't know how to fight. He didn't know how to dodge. He didn't know how to block blows. He knew one thing: how to use his hands and how to see. He saw a rope. His rope, the one he'd stretched along the balcony 2 days ago to dry thin slats. The rope ran from the railing to a hook in the wall. 3 slats hung from it, each weighing a couple of kilograms. Danny didn't think. His hands acted before his brain. He yanked the knot on the railing. The rope slackened. The slats flew, not at the killer, at the block. At the wooden block that Danny had hung as a counterweight for hoisting the boards. The block swung. It struck the second rope. The second rope was tied to the heavy board he hoisted onto the balcony that morning and hadn't had time to remove. The plank broke loose, 3 meters long, 20 kilograms of elven oak. It swung like a pendulum, fast. The killer hadn't expected this. He'd been expecting a small, helpless man, not a system of counterweights. The plank struck him in the knees. He collapsed. The knife flew out of his hand. It clattered against the stone floor of the balcony. Danny grabbed the knife. His hands were shaking. The knife was heavy, an elven dagger the size of his forearm. The killer was lying on the floor. His knees were broken. The plank had struck true. He tried to get up. He couldn't. He looked up at Danny. For the first time in his life, an elf was looking up at him. There was hatred in his eyes and surprise. He didn't understand what had happened. Danny didn't really understand either. He stood with the dagger in his trembling hands over the defeated assassin and thought this was the longest moment of his life. The guards arrived a minute later, 2 Red Guard fighters. They saw the assassin on the floor. They saw Danny with the dagger, and they froze. One of them whispered something to the other. Danny caught a word that meant either madman or lucky guy. The assassin was dragged away. Kayla rushed in 5 minutes later, in light armor, hair down, eyes ablaze. She burst onto the balcony and immediately grabbed Danny, lifted him up, examined him, turned him this way and that, like checking a doll for damage. He said he was fine. She wasn't listening. She was examining him. Then she pulled him close, tightly, too tightly. He squeaked. She loosened her grip. Then she set him on the floor and looked at the plank, at the ropes, at the pulley, at the system. She asked what it was. Danny explained. A counterweight for lifting the planks. Kayla was silent. Then she said that he had killed the trained assassin Tenevel with the plank lifting system. Danny corrected her. Didn't kill him, broke his knees. Kayla looked at him for a long time. Then she laughed, loudly, so loudly that the birds flew up from the nearest treetops and flew away. She said he was either the smartest person she'd ever met or the luckiest. Danny replied that he was neither. He just always hung his tools so they were within reach. Kayla laughed for another minute. Then she grew serious. She said the killer was from House Tenevel, from the Old Guard, from Velcori's people. There was no direct evidence. Velcori would say it was a lone wolf, a fanatic, that he was shocked and outraged, that he would personally ensure it never happened again. And all of it would be a lie. But a lie that cannot be disproved. Danny asked what he should do. Kayla said that for now, he would go with her. That there would now be a permanent guard at the door to his workshop. Not 2 guards, 4. And that he'd better come up with more of those rope systems, because she can't be there every second. And they'll try again. She took his hand sank into her palm, and led him downstairs. Down the stairs, through the corridors, past the guards. Past the lords who were looking back. Past the servants who were whispering. A small man and a huge warrior, hand in hand. On the way, Danny twisted his ankle on a step. The steps were knee-high. He stumbled, his leg cracked. It wasn't broken, but his ankle flared with pain. He hissed. Kayla turned around. She looked down. She saw him wincing. Without a word, she bent down. She lifted him into her arms, with just her left arm. She held him close to her side. His legs dangled. His head was level with her shoulder. She carried him like a basket of fruit, easily, naturally, as if it were normal. She carried him down the hallway past the guards. The guards looked away, but Danny saw. Some were smiling, not maliciously, more like surprised. Kayla carried him to the workshop, set him down on the workbench, examined his ankle. Her fingers were as thick as his wrist, but they moved carefully, gently. She felt the joint and said it wasn't broken, a sprain. She said she'd send a doctor, and that he wouldn't be getting up from that workbench for 2 days. Danny replied that he had work to do. Kayla said his work could wait. He said no, it wouldn't wait. Kayla looked at him. He looked at her. From the bottom up, from the workbench, he came up to about her chest. She said he was stubborn. He said it was professional. She left. She stopped at the door, turned around, and said quietly, almost tenderly, that if he went out onto the balcony alone again, she'd tie him to herself.
The door closed. Tally showed up 10 minutes later. She already knew. News traveled faster in the palace than a sylvair. She came with bandages, with ointment, and with gnome brandy. She said the bandages were for his ankle, and the brandy was for his nerves. Danny drank. It burned like molten copper. Tally sat down next to him on the floor. She was shorter than the workbench. Only the top of her red head stuck out. She said the killer would talk. Or he wouldn't. Dwarves know how Tenevel works.
Poison in the shadows, a knife in the back, a smile at the council. She said Velcor was dangerous not because he was evil, but because he believed he was right. Fanatics who believe they're right are more dangerous than any mercenary. Danny asked what Velcor wanted. Tally paused. Then she said that, in her opinion, Velcor wanted everything to end beautifully, for a Lorien to die with dignity, like an old aristocratic family, without fuss, without a fight, without outside help, and certainly without a little man with fish glue and a chisel. Danny sat quietly. Then he said he understood. Tally asked what exactly he understood. Danny said he understood that he needed to work faster. Tally snorted, said he was crazy, then poured him some more brandy. In the evening, Morwen came, as usual, silently. She saw him at the workbench with his leg rebandaged. Her impassive face didn't change, but she approached, closely, closer than usual. She stood beside him and placed 2 fingers on his ankle, gently, like placing fingers on a butterfly's wing. A chill passed through the bandage, pleasant, deep. The pain receded. It didn't go away, but it quieted down. Danny looked at her. She withdrew her hand, sat down in her corner, silently. He asked if it was magic. She didn't answer. They sat in silence until midnight. Then she left. At the door, she said, "Don't go out onto the balcony alone," and added even more quietly, "Please." It was the first please he'd ever heard from her. Danny lay on the workbench in the dark. His ankle hardly hurt at all. Behind the wall, 4 guards were stomping about instead of 2. Somewhere upstairs, Kayla was interrogating the murderer. Somewhere in the moonlit hall, Iselin was playing the lute he had repaired. Somewhere in the shadows of the palace, Velcori was planning his next move. And he lay there, a small man in a world of giants, with a sprained ankle and a chisel under his pillow. And he thought about how his grandfather had been right. The head argues, the hands remember. Today, his hands had yanked the rope before his head realized what was happening. His hands had saved his life. He looked at his palms in the darkness, at the calluses, at the scars, at the lines. Then he clenched his fists, and for the first time since coming into this world, he didn't think about how to survive, but how to stay. His ankle healed in 4 days. Morwen came every night and placed 2 fingers on the bandage. The cold seeped into the joint and drew out the inflammation. She didn't call it magic. Danny didn't ask. By the 15th day, he was walking normally again. The workshop had changed during that time. Tally brought a second set of tools, a finer set, for fine carving. Danny hung them on the wall in a row, each on its own hook, each within reach. He looked at the wall and saw his grandfather's workshop in Portland. Only instead of the smell of coffee and the radio, it smelled of resin and silence. The first real order came from Iselin, not a personal one, an official one. The House of Sylvandir was preparing a reception for the ambassadors of the Podgornaya Guild. The gnomes were due to arrive in 2 weeks. Iselin came in the morning, a moon-white dress, silver eyes. She sat down on a small stool, and her knees rose up to her chin again. She said that the gnome ambassadors were always seated at a low table, on the floor, at the feet of the elven lords, that it had been that way for centuries, that the gnomes had endured it, but their patience is running out. The chief dwarf ambassador, Barg Ironfang, has already threatened twice to revoke the trade agreements. Danny asked why they couldn't just lower the table. Iselin explained, in a Lorien, the council table is not a piece of furniture. It is a symbol. The height of the table equals the height of one's status. Lowering the table for the gnomes means publicly declaring that their status is higher. Raising the gnomes to the level of the elven table is impossible. They can't reach it, physically. Danny listened. Then he asked, what if height didn't matter? Iselin raised an eyebrow. He asked for 3 days. She smiled. She said he always asks for 3 days. Danny replied that 3 days was the right amount of time. A day to figure it out, a day to do it, a day to check it. That's what Grandpa taught him. He started right away. The problem wasn't the table. The problem was that there was only one table. Straight, one height. Everyone sat at it. And everyone shorter than the table was automatically shorter than those taller than it. Danny drew. He sketched. He calculated. Tally sat next to him and smoked a pipe. The smoke smelled of cherries and iron. She asked what he had in mind. He explained. A long modular table. At one end, the standard elven height, 1.40 meters from the floor. At the other end, via a gentle slope of the tabletop and stepped seats, a height that is comfortable for gnomes, humans, and short elves. Everyone at one table. A single tabletop, unbroken. But the floor beneath it is stepped. Those sitting lower sit on a higher step. Those sitting higher sit on a lower step. And everyone's eyes are at the same level, not the same height, the same view. Tally was silent for a long time. Then she took the pipe out of her mouth and said he was a genius. Or an idiot, but more likely a genius. And that she needed hinges, lots of hinges, because the table would be foldable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to carry it into the hall. They worked for 3 days straight. Danny slept 4 hours at a time. Tally slept 3. She forged the mounting hinges and the guides. He cut the wood, planed, sanded, fitted. Iselin sent 4 carpenters from the palace staff. They stood and watched as a little man and a dwarf bossed them around. One carpenter said he wouldn't take orders from creatures that came up to his waist. Tally walked up to him, tilted her head. The carpenter was 6'2". She was 5'9". She said 3 words to him in Dwarven. The carpenter didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. They worked in silence after that. On the 3rd day, the table was ready, disassembled. 12 sections, 8 steps, 32 seats. Each seat was tailored to a specific height range. The dwarf seats were wider and deeper. The elven seats were taller and narrower. The human seats were in the middle. Everything fits. Everything comes apart. Everything is connected by teleloops that work like clockwork. The day of the reception, the council hall. Danny asked for 2 hours before the start. The guards brought in the sections. He directed the assembly, standing on a stepladder, shouting up at the elves holding the sections. Tally was down below, tightening the fasteners. The table stood up. Long, beautiful, alternating strips of light and dark wood. The tabletop was a single plane, but the floor beneath it rose and fell in waves. The seats were built into the steps as part of a single structure. At one end would sit an elf, 3 meters tall. At the other, a dwarf, 3 feet 30 inches tall. And both would be looking each other in the eye. Guests began to enter. The lords of the 3 houses. Tall, majestic. They saw the table and froze. Then the dwarves entered. Barg Ironfang first. Short, broad, a beard down to his waist, an axe at his belt. He saw the table. He saw the seats. He looked at Danny, who was standing by the wall, small, in an apron covered in sawdust. Barg walked to his seat, sat down, placed his hands on the table. His eyes were exactly level with those of Lord Sylvandear across from him. Exactly. For the first time in centuries, a dwarf looked at an elven lord in the eyes at the council table, not tilting his head back, not looking up from below. Straight on. Danny stood by the wall and said nothing. Iselin looked at him. Kayla looked at him. Morwen looked at him. Barg Ironfang silently removed his axe from his belt. He placed it on the table, blade away from himself. It was a sign of eternal peace. According to gnome custom, it meant that at this table, he would never raise a weapon. The hall was silent. Danny said quietly that he didn't know how to make everyone the same height, but he knew how to make height stop being an insult. Kayla began to cry, loudly, without restraint. Morwen smiled, for the first time in public. Iselin found his hand under the table and squeezed it. Her palm covered his entire wrist, warm. Velcore sat at the far end. His face was calm, friendly. He smiled like a kind old man. But Danny noticed. His fingers were clenching the edge of the table, white knuckles. The kind old man wasn't used to sitting at the same table with dwarves as equals. The reception was over. Barg stayed behind. He walked over to Danny, looked down at him, half a head taller. A gnome and a man, almost the same height. Barg said the table would stay, that he would personally tear the arms off anyone who touched it, and that Danny Park was from this day forward a friend of the Podgornaya Guild. Danny shook his hand, firmly. After the incident with the table, orders came pouring in. Not from princesses, from ordinary elves. The gardener of House Sylvandear came with pruning shears that couldn't handle the new shoots. The shoots were thinner and drier than before. The tree's illness was changing everything. Danny examined the shears. Elven craftsmanship, carved from a single piece of wood with a blade of hardened silver. Beautiful, useless. The blade was straight, for healthy, thick branches, but the branches had become thin and brittle. The straight blade crushed them instead of cutting them. Danny asked Tally to reforge the blade, curved, with a crescent-shaped profile. Like Earth's garden shears, Tally reforged it in a day. The gardener tried it. The shoot was cut cleanly, without damage. The gardener stood and looked at the cut, then at Danny, then back at the cut, and left without saying a word. The next day, he came with 3 other gardeners. They all wanted the same. Then the weaver came. Her loom creaked. Then the armorer came. The handles on the training swords were breaking. Then the cook came. The cutting table was wobbling. Danny fixed everything, not with magic, with his hands. A chisel, glue, a whetstone, common sense. He tailored every item to the person it belonged to. He didn't just fix them, he improved them, made them more comfortable, made them more precise, for a specific hand, for a specific task. The elves watched this and didn't understand. They were used to something else. An object would break, and the wood would decide to leave. The ritualists would sing a funeral dirge. They would grow a new object, exactly the same, without considering why the previous one had broken. Danny didn't sing a funeral dirge. He asked why. Why it broke. Where was the crack? Where was the stress coming from? And he made sure it wouldn't break again. It was almost blasphemy, and almost a miracle. In the 3rd week, Neriel came to the workshop. Neri, 156 years old, 2 meters 64, a short elf, a dwarf by elven standards. Her growth had stopped because of the tree's illness. The Silva air in her blood was too weak to keep growing. Society considered her defective. They didn't even try to find her a husband, because children born to her would be even smaller. So they said. She hid away in libraries. She read forbidden books. She knew the prophecy of the roots and a dozen other texts by heart. She entered the workshop sideways, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. She was a head taller than Danny, but she moved like a little girl. She slumped. She hid her hands. She didn't look him in the eye. She said she needed a desk, that standard elven tables were too high for her, that she sat at them and had to stretch, that her arms got tired, that her back hurt. She spoke quickly, as if apologizing for coming. Danny listened. Then he said, "Wait." She fell silent. He walked over to her, tilted his head back. 5'6". He was shoulder to shoulder with her. He said she was exactly his height plus a meter, that she was the only one here with whom he could talk normally without craning his neck toward the ceiling. Neri blinked. He asked which hand she wrote with. Her right. He asked how long her forearm was. He measured it. He asked how far from her eyes she usually held a book. He measured that too. He asked if she sat with her legs crossed or straight. Crossed, because straight ones don't fit under any table. He wrote everything down on birch bark. He said it would be ready in 4 days. Neri stood there. She looked at him. Then she asked quietly why he was asking all this. Everyone just makes a table, a standard one. Danny replied that he doesn't make tables. He makes a table for a specific person who will sit at it in a specific way and write with a specific hand and read at a specific distance. Neri was silent. Her eyes were shining. She nodded and left, quickly, as if she were afraid of crying in front of him. 4 days. He worked on the desk alongside other orders. The desk wasn't small or child-sized. It was for an adult, a full-fledged one, a work desk, with a slanted section for reading, with a recess for the right elbow so her arm wouldn't get tired, with a bookshelf at eye level, with legs that could be adjusted for height because Danny didn't know what she would be sitting on. Everything sanded smooth. Everything was fitted. Everything was for her. Neri came to pick it up. She saw the table. She ran her hand over the tabletop, slowly. Then she sat down. She rested her hands. Her elbow fit perfectly into the recess. Her eyes were level with the bookshelf. Her back straightened. Because the table was at the perfect height, no need to stretch or hunch over. She sat there, quietly, her hands on the wood, and she whispered that she'd thought she'd be uncomfortable her whole life. Danny stood nearby. He didn't say a word. Words weren't needed. From that day on, Neri came to the workshop every day, in the morning, with books. She would sit in the corner and read. She translated old texts for Danny. She told him about the history of Aelorian, about the ancestral tree, about the covenant, about the disease. She knew more than most lords, because they read only what was permitted, and she read everything. Once she looked up from her book and said that the Tenevel archives contained records of other visitors, not just one, several, over the last 500 years. They all appeared the same way, out of nowhere, small, with a trade. They all died. Accidents, falls, drownings, poison. Danny stopped planing. He looked at her. She said the records were incomplete. Some had been destroyed, but she'd found 3 names, 3 people. One had appeared 200 years ago, the second 150, the third 70. All 3 lived in Aelorian for no more than a year. All 3 died. Danny asked what they died of. Neri said officially from accidents. One fell from a balcony. One drowned in the bathhouse. One tripped over a root and broke his neck. Danny looked silently at his bandaged ankle. Then he looked at the ceiling. Somewhere up there was the balcony from which they had tried to throw him 10 days ago. He said the picture was clear. Neri nodded. She said that the tree calls those who can save it, and someone has been intercepting that call for a very long time. Not the call, those whom the tree summons. They are being killed for centuries, systematically. Danny set the chisel down on the workbench. His hands weren't shaking. His mind was working. 3 visitors in 500 years, all dead, all from accidents. And now he was the 4th. He asked who could have known about the visitors. Neri said the records were kept in the Tenevel archives. Only the High Ritualist had access. Velcor. Danny didn't tell the princesses right away. He thought. For 2 days. He worked and thought. Neri sat in the corner and waited. Tally was forging brackets for the new shelves and glancing at him. She knew something was wrong. Gnomes sense trouble like miners sense gas, through intuition and scent. On the 3rd day, he called everyone together, not to the council hall, to the workshop. There wasn't enough room. Iselin came first. She stood by the wall. Kayla walked in and took up a quarter of the workshop. Morwen appeared in the corner. She just materialized, as if a shadow had thickened and become her. Tally sat at the workbench. Neri stood by the door. Danny stood in the center, on a stool. Because otherwise, the 3 princesses would be looking at him at an angle of 45 degrees downward, and everyone's necks would have gone stiff. He told them everything Neri had found. 3 strangers, all dead. The Tenevel archives. Velcori access. Silence. Kayla clenched her fists. Her knuckles cracked. A sound like a tree snapping. She said she would kill him. Right now. She would go and kill him. Iselin shook her head. She said she couldn't. No evidence. Archive records aren't evidence. Velcori will say the records were always there, that anyone could have read them, that it's a coincidence. Morwen was silent. She stared at the floor. Then she looked up. Dark. Deep. She said Velcori was her uncle, 2nd cousin, head of the Tenevel ritual branch, that he had raised her since childhood after her mother's death, that he had taught her to speak with dead trees, that she trusted him more than anyone else. She spoke evenly, without emotion, as if reading a report, but her gloved hands clenched and unclenched, rhythmically, like a pulse. Danny asked what they were going to do. Iselin said they needed to proceed with caution, gather evidence, watch, wait for a mistake. Kayla said it was a waste of time and that while they waited, Danny would get a knife in the back. Morwen said she could enter the Tenevel archives, legally. She's a princess of the Shadow House. She has access. Not to everything, but to most of it. She can search. Quietly. Danny listened. 3 strategies. Diplomatic, military, shadow. 3 princesses, 3 houses, 3 approaches. He said all 3 were right, and all 3 were needed. Iselin watches Velcori in the council. Kayla sets up a guard and prepares a forceful option as a last resort. Morwen is searching the archives, and he'll do what he does best. Work. Loudly, in plain sight, taking orders, showing results. The more elves see that he's useful, the harder it will be to kill him quietly. Kayla said that wasn't a plan. It was a target. Danny replied that a target everyone sees is harder to eliminate than a target everyone has forgotten. The 3 previous visitors died because they were alone and nobody needed them. He won't be alone, and he will be needed. Kayla was silent. Then she nodded. Slowly. She said she didn't like this plan, but she understood. They parted ways. The work began. Danny opened his workshop to everyone. The doors stayed open from morning till night. Orders, repairs, consultations. He repaired furniture, tools, household items. He customized every piece. He explained to everyone what and why. Word spread. That little man in the Sylvandir basement, who fixes what's broken, who asks which hand it's for, who makes things comfortable. By the end of the first month, there was a line outside the workshop. Danny worked 14-hour days. Tally scolded him, saying he'd wear himself out, that he wasn't an elf and wouldn't live 500 years to get everything done, that he needed to sleep. Danny slept 5 hours, sometimes 4. Iselin noticed. She came one evening, not with an order, with a pillow. Huge by his standards, normal by elven standards. She placed the pillow on the workbench and said that if he insisted on sleeping in the workshop, then at least not on the bare wood. Danny looked at the pillow. It was the size of his torso. Soft. It smelled of pine needles and something lunar. He said thank you. Iselin sat down on the floor next to the workbench, in a dress, on the dirty floor. The princess of the moon house, a diplomat, an heiress, on the floor next to a little man. She asked if he was tired. Danny replied that he was. She asked if he missed home. Danny fell silent. Home. Portland. His grandfather's workshop. The smell of coffee. The radio. Rain on the roof of the pickup truck. He said sometimes. She asked what his home was like. He told her, briefly. A small workshop. His grandfather. The smell of varnish. Wood shavings on the floor. A window onto the yard. A parking lot nearby, a burger joint behind the lot. In the evenings, the smell of grilled meat mingled with the scent of cedar. Iselin listened. Her silver eyes didn't blink. She said she wanted to hear more. Later, when he wanted to tell her. She stood up, 6 feet tall. She leaned down. She touched his hair with her fingertips, gently, like touching the first spring leaf. And she left. Danny was lying on a pillow. It smelled of pine needles. He was staring at the ceiling. In the darkness of the workshop, the gnome clock that Tally had hung on the wall was ticking. The only mechanical thing in the whole palace. Tick-tock, tick-tock. A familiar sound, a human sound. He closed his eyes and thought that a house is not a place. A house is when someone makes you a pillow and sits down next to you on the dirty floor. The third month, the craft fair. Iselin had announced it 2 weeks ago. A tradition of House Sylvandir. Once a season, the masters exhibit their best works. The lords judge them. The winner earns the right to accept an order from the royal court. For the last 300 years, the same craftsmen have won. Elven gardeners who grew furniture from living trees. Slowly, beautifully, identically. Iselin suggested that Danny participate. He refused at first. He said he was an outsider, that it was their tradition, that he didn't want to meddle. Iselin looked down at him. 3 meters and 2 centimeters of patient silver gaze. She said that the prophecy had made him part of their world, that refusing to participate wasn't modesty, it was cowardice. Danny opened his mouth, then shut it. She was right. He agreed. 2 weeks to prepare. He knew what he had to present. Not just a beautiful thing, a thing that would say what no one here had ever said, a thing the elves didn't have. A thing that would change their perspective. A folding chair. The elves didn't have folding things at all. Everything was solid, grown, monolithic. A chair was a chair forever. A table was a table forever. A door was a door forever. The idea that a thing could change shape, to fold up, to unfold, to be one thing and then another. To them, it was as if a tree had decided to stop being a tree and become a stone. Impossible, indecent, almost offensive. Danny was working. The chair had to be elven-sized for a 3-meter tall elf. The seat a meter off the floor. The backrest up to 2 meters. Wide, sturdy, designed to support a creature weighing 200 kilograms, and foldable. Tally was forging the hinges, special ones, with a latch. Danny had devised a mechanism she hadn't seen before. 3 points of support that lock when unfolded. The chair stands as if rooted to the spot, but one movement, one hand, one twist, and it folds flat, 2 palms thick. It can be carried under the arm, even by a human, if the human is strong. He chose local wood, Aelorian ironwood, heavy, sturdy, dark red, with a golden grain. He worked at night. Morwen sat in the corner and watched. Sometimes she brought him food. She silently placed the plate nearby. She silently left. Once, she stayed until dawn. Danny was sanding the leg of a chair, monotonously, evenly, sandpaper back and forth. Morwen looked at his hands. Then she quietly said that he had beautiful hands. Danny stopped. He looked at his hands. Calluses, scars, ingrown dust, a broken nail on his right pinky. He said it was the first time anyone had ever said that. Morwen replied that in her house, beauty wasn't about smoothness. Beauty is the traces of what you've done. Danny looked at her. She was looking at his hands. Not at him, at his hands. And there was something in her dark eyes that made his chest feel warm. He went back to sanding. She stayed until morning. Fair day. The square in front of Sylvandir Palace, huge, like a football field, stands made of living wood. Artisans displayed their work. Chairs, tables, harps, bows, cradles, all grown, all beautiful, all equally beautiful. Smooth lines, organic shapes, not a single right angle, not a single joint, not a single seam. Danny's stall was in the corner, small. He'd built it himself. There was a chair at the stand. One, a folding chair, made of ironwood, dark red, with a golden texture. A sign next to it. Neri had written in Elvish, "A folding chair for an elf, Master Danny Park." The first visitors approached with curiosity. They looked, they touched, some frowned, some shook their heads. A master gardener approached and said loudly that it was an insult, that wood wasn't meant to be folded, that it was an assault on the material, that it was barbarism. Elves began to gather around. Some agreed, some remained silent. The master gardener was tall, 6 feet 2, with long fingers, green from sap. He looked down at Danny, literally and figuratively. Danny didn't argue. He walked over to the chair, sat down on a stool nearby, and demonstrated. One move. The chair folded, flat, thin, light. The crowd froze. Another movement. The chair unfolded. It stood up, sturdy, stable. Danny invited the master gardener to sit down. He hesitated. Then he sat down. 6 feet 2 inches tall, 280 pounds. The chair didn't creak. It didn't wobble. It stood as if rooted to the spot. The master sat there, silently. Then he stood up. He looked at the chair. He looked at Danny. He said nothing and left. But the crowd stayed and began to grow. By noon, there were more elves standing at Danny's booth than at all the other booths combined. They were folding and unfolding the chair, over and over, like children with a new toy. They took turns sitting on it. They fiddled with the hinges. They felt the joints. They couldn't believe wood could do that. Iselin stood to the side and smiled. Kayla laughed out loud when one of the lords folded the chair over his head and tried to carry it through the crowd. Morwen stood in the shadows and looked at Danny, not at the chair, at him. By evening, representatives from all three houses had approached him with orders. 12 folding chairs for the Red Guards field camp, 6 for the Tenevel Library, 4 for the Sylvandir Music Hall. Danny stood before the 3 elven customers, each of whom was twice his height, and he took their orders with dignity, like a master, not like a princess's housebound outsider. That evening in the workshop, Tally did the math. 22 chairs, 16 loops on each, 3,500 loops. She said Danny owed her enough brandy to last her a year. Danny said he'd pay. Tally snorted. She said it wasn't about the brandy. The point was that for the first time in 41 years of her work in Aelorian, the elves had ordered something from a master who works with dead wood.
He doesn't grow it. He cuts it. He planes it. He glues it. And to her, that's worth more than brandy. She paused. Then she added that she needed the brandy too, after all. The 6th month. The workshop had changed. No longer a storage room with scaffolding. A real workshop. 2 workbenches, a tool rack, a drying rack, a shelf with blanks, a pulley system under the ceiling for lifting heavy things, a gnome clock on the wall, Isolin's pillow in the corner, the smell of shavings and fish glue, and 3 huge armchairs. Danny made them in the first few months, 1 for each of them. Isolin's armchair was light-colored, made of moon ash, with a high back and armrests that were comfortable to rest long-fingered hands on. Kayla's armchair was wide, made of red oak, with a reinforced frame because Kayla would plop down into the chairs as if she were falling into them, with all her weight, with a swing. She broke the first chair in 3 days. Danny reinforced the second one so it could hold a bear. Morwen's chair was dark, made of black walnut, deep, with high sides, like a nest. Morwen curled up in it and became almost invisible in her black clothes. Only her eyes shone in the darkness of the chair. The 3 chairs stood by a small hearth that Tally had built out of stones. The hearth was illegal, an open fire in a palace made of living wood. Isolin turned a blind eye to it. Danny said that a workshop without a fire wasn't a workshop. The hearth provided warmth. 3 armchairs waited, and 3 princesses would come. Every evening, at least one of them would sit in her armchair while Danny worked. Sometimes all 3. Then the workshop filled with voices. Isolin spoke softly, about music, about politics, about how tired she was of maintaining the balance between the houses. Kayla spoke loudly, about training, about the new recruits, about how one of them tried to challenge her to a duel and regretted it 2 seconds later. Morwen was silent, but sometimes she would say a single sentence, and that sentence was worth the whole conversation. The 6th month. Night. Danny was working late, sanding a box, a small one, tiny by elven standards, ordinary by his standards, made of black walnut, with a lock. Tally had made the lock, tiny, silver, with a key the size of a fingernail. The box was for Morwen. He didn't know why a box specifically. His hands knew. His head didn't yet. Morwen came at midnight, as usual, silently. She sat down in her chair, curled up, her eyes in the dark. Danny was working, sanding the lid, over and over, until the wood was as smooth as glass. Then he turned to her, walked over, held out the box. Morwen took it. Her hands were long, her fingers slender. The box in her palms looked like a matchbox. She opened it. Nothing inside. Empty. Lined with dark velvet that Dan had traded for from the merchants at the port. Morwen stared at the empty box. Danny said this was the place where she could put what she didn't want to carry inside her all the time. Morwen didn't look up. She silently slipped the glove off her left hand. Her skin was pale, almost white. She took a strand of her black hair, cut it off with a dagger, in one swift motion. She placed the strand in the box, closed it, turned the key, set the box on her knee, Danny stood beside her. His head was level with her shoulder even when she was sitting. Morwen looked up, dark, deep, like a well into which one could fall and fall. She leaned forward, slowly, very slowly, like a tower leaning, and touched his crown with her lips, gently, barely perceptibly, like a falling leaf. In the house of Tenevel, this is how they kiss those they fear losing. Danny stood. He didn't move. His heart was pounding so loudly that he was sure she could hear it. Morwen straightened up. She stood. 3 meters minus 2 centimeters. She pressed the box to her chest. And she left. Silently. Like a shadow. Danny stood in the empty workshop. The fire was dying down. 3 chairs stood in a semicircle. The gnome clock ticked. He raised his hand and touched the top of his head, where her lips had been. Warm. He stood like that for a minute. Then he sat down on the floor, with his back to Morwen's chair. The wood smelled of nuts and something nocturnal. And for the first time since coming into this world, Danny Park honestly admitted to himself what he'd realized as early as the 2nd week. That he loved them. All 3 of them. In different ways, but all 3. Iselin, with her quiet voice and silver eyes and questions that always hit the mark. Kayla, with her thunder and tears and hands that could have crushed him, but instead carried him more gently than he carried his violin. Morwen, with her silence and her shadow and the kiss on the top of his head that made the world stop for a second. He loved them. It was wrong by any earthly standard. 3 at once. 3 princesses. 3 giantesses. And he was a little craftsman with fish glue under his fingernails. But these were not earthly standards. Here, there was the prophecy, and the 3 houses, and 1 huge, ailing tree, and his hands, which mended what the elves buried. He sat on the floor, with his back to the chair, and for the first time, he didn't feel small. In the morning, he found a note on the workbench, on birch bark, in Neri's handwriting. She wrote that she had found something in the archives, not about the visitors, about rituals, about the sacrificial oils that Tenevel had been preparing for the ancestral tree for centuries. The recipe had changed 200 years ago, slightly. 1 addition, 1 ingredient. Neri didn't know what that ingredient was, but she knew who had made the change. Velkor Tenevel, a young ritualist at the time, not yet the high priest, but already with access to the sacred recipes. Danny read the note. Then he read it again. 200 years, 1 addition, 1 ingredient in the sacrificial oil that was regularly applied to the roots of the ancestral tree. For 200 years, poison had been entering the tree through the ritual, through a sacred ritual that no one would dare to question because the ritual is sacred. His hands didn't tremble. His mind was working. He folded the note and tucked it into his apron pocket. Then he picked up a chisel and began to work. Because before he could prove that the tree was being poisoned, he needed to see it with his own eyes. And to do that, he needed to get to the ancestral tree. And to do that, he needed the 3 houses to let a little man into the greatest sanctuary of their world. Getting to the ancestral tree. Progenitor tree turned out to be harder than repairing a lute. The tree stood in the center of Aelorian, in the sacred grove, closed to everyone except the high ritualists of the 3 houses, and royalty, and those they admitted. Danny needed the consent of all 3 houses simultaneously. Iselin could have escorted him as a guest of the Sylvandir, but without the consent of Kayran and Tenevel, that would have been a violation of the tripartite treaty. Kayla could have ordered the Scarlet Guard to clear the way, but that would be an act of war. Morwen could open a shadow path, but that would be a ritual act without the sanction of the High Ritualist, that is, Velkori. The circle was complete.
Danny sat in the workshop. He thought. Tally was forging hinges. Neri was reading. Morwen was sitting in a chair. Iselin was at the council. Kayla was at training. He thought for 3 days. On the 4th, he called everyone together. Back to the workshop. Back to the stool. He said there was one way, not military, not diplomatic, not covert. Artisanal. He proposed announcing a general inspection of the tree, not a ritual one, a technical one, like an inspection of a building or a ship or a bridge. The tree is sick. Everyone knows this, but no one has ever inspected it the way a craftsman inspects damaged material. Ritualists recited prayers, healers poured elixirs, but no one approached the bark or touched it with their hands. No one tapped the trunk. No one checked the roots for rot. No one looked at the tree as a tree. Just a tree. A very large one, a very sick one, but a tree. Iselin listened. Her silver eyes narrowed. She thought. Then she said, it might work, if presented as care, not as interference. A master craftsman, recognized by the prophecy, asks to examine the tree to help. It is not a violation of the ritual, it is an addition. Kayla said she would provide security. 5 Red Guard fighters, just in case. Morwen was silent. Then she said quietly that Velcor would be against it. He would find a reason. He always finds a reason, she paused, and added that she would go with Danny, as a Tanavel ritualist, by right of blood. Velcori might object to a master from another house, but he cannot object to a princess of his own house. Danny looked at her. She was looking away, but a faint blush lay on her cheeks, the first he'd seen in 6 months. The council convened a week later. Iselin spoke, calmly, gently, in a cello-like voice. She did not ask, she suggested, a reasonable decision at a reasonable time. Master Danny Park will examine the ancestral tree, not ritually, technically, as a master examines a material, under the supervision of Princess Tenevel, under the protection of the Scarlet Guard, with the consent of all 3 houses. Velcore stood up, the face of a kind old man, a warm smile. He said the idea was wonderful, that he was delighted by the resourcefulness of the little stranger, that caring for the tree was the highest good, and that he personally would be happy to accompany the inspection, as the supreme ritualist, to ensure that everything proceeded with due respect. Danny felt his stomach tighten. Velcor wanted to be there. He wanted to see. He wanted to control. Morwen looked at her uncle, a motionless face, impenetrable eyes. She said she would be glad of his presence. The council approved, unanimously. The date was set for 3 days later. Danny spent those 3 days preparing. He gathered his tools, not for repairs, for diagnostics. A thin knife for bark cuttings, a hammer for tapping, a magnifying glass that Tally had carved from raw crystal, test tubes made of blown glass, also Tally's work, for samples. Neri gave him a copy of the old recipe for sacrificial oil, and the new one, with the addition of Velcor. Danny studied the difference. The addition was plant-based, an extract of some root. Neri hadn't found the name, but she'd found a description. The root grew only in Dead Ravine, a ravine on the edge of Alorian, where trees didn't grow, where the earth was gray, where nothing living lingered. Poison from a place where life is impossible, added to the sacred oil that nourishes the roots of the tree. 200 years, drop by drop, ritual by ritual. Danny clenched the note in his fist. The morning of the inspection, the sacred grove. Danny walked between Morwen and Kayla. Iselin led the way. Behind them were 5 Red Guard fighters, and Velcor, smiling. The grove was different, not like a palace, not like a city. Quieter, deeper, darker. The trees here were old, not just old, ancient. They remembered a time before the elves. Their crowns completely obscured the sky. Light came only from the moss on the roots, greenish, dim. The air was thick, heavy. It smelled of earth and something sweetish, rot. Danny sensed it immediately. The smell of rot beneath the smell of life, like a crack beneath the paint. Then he saw the tree. He stopped. Everyone stopped. The ancestral tree. Danny had seen old trees, the redwoods in California, his grandfather's 400-year-old oak in Portland. But this, the trunk stretched upward and disappeared, not into the crown, into the sky. The crown was a cloud, a green cloud. The roots emerged from the ground like mountain ranges. Each root was as thick as a house. Danny's entire workshop could have fit between the roots, and there would still have been room. The bark was silvery gray, covered in moss and lichen, alive, but dull, like the skin of a sick person. Danny walked up. He placed his hand on the bark and closed his eyes. Hands know before the head does, Grandpa used to say. A tree speaks to you if you listen with your fingers. He listened. Beneath the bark, deep down. A slow pulsation, weak, like a heart that's tired of beating. The moisture was uneven, drier on the left, wetter on the right. Fibers, twisted, unnatural. Something was pressing on them from the inside. And a smell through the bark, sweetish, familiar, the same smell as in Dead Creek. Danny opened his eyes. He walked around the trunk, slowly, tapping, listening, touching. Velcore followed him, watching, smiling. Morwen walked on the other side, silently. Her eyes weren't on Danny, they were on Velcore. Danny found it on the south side of the trunk, low down, at his own height, at a level that a ritualist elf standing 3 feet 24 inches tall would never have seen, because to do so, he would have had to kneel. And elves do not kneel before the tree. It is blasphemy. A small indentation in the bark, the size of a palm, his palm. The end of something metallic was sticking out of the indentation. Dark, covered in resin and moss, invisible, grown into the bark. A nail. Danny didn't touch it, didn't show it. He straightened up, turned to the others, and said calmly that the inspection was complete, that he needed time to think about what he'd seen, that he would report to the council. Velcore nodded, warmly, approvingly. On the way back, Danny walked beside Morwen, a few steps behind the others. He said one sentence to her, quietly, barely moving his lips. He said he'd found the nail. Morwen hadn't slept for 3 days. Danny knew because she'd come to the workshop every night. She'd sit in the chair, not slouching as usual, sitting up straight, hands on the armrests, eyes open. She was thinking. On the 3rd night, she spoke. She said she'd check the archives. The sacrificial nail is part of the renewal ritual. Once every 50 years, the ritualist drives a consecrated nail into the bark of the tree, a nail of pure silver, soaked in sacrificial oil. The tree accepts it, absorbs it. The nail dissolves over 10 years and nourishes the inner layers. It had always been that way, but the nail Danny found hadn't dissolved. It was sticking out. For 100 years, maybe longer. Silver doesn't stick out for 100 years. It sinks into the wood. So it isn't silver. Danny asked what it was then. Morwen said she didn't know, but she knew who had driven in the last 4 nails. Velkhori. Personally, by right of the High Ritualist. Every 50 years. 4 nails, 200 years. Danny did the math. 4 nails in 200 years. He found 1, so there were 3 more somewhere in the bark, at his height, because the one who hammered them in was tall and struck from above, at an angle. The nail entered the bark and went down, to a level no elf had ever looked at. In the morning, he gathered everyone, the workshop again, the stool again. Neri brought a book, an old one, from the restricted section of the Tenevel library. The book contained a recipe for sacrificial oil, the original, 1,000 years old, and next to it, for comparison, the recipe Velkhori had used. The difference was in one ingredient: root extract from deadbeam. Danny didn't know what kind of root it was, but he knew what poison does to wood. He'd seen it 1,000 times. In Portland, in his grandfather's workshop, customers brought in furniture, old, antique. Sometimes the furniture was poisoned, not on purpose, just that someone had used the wrong varnish, or the wrong preservative, or stored it near chemicals. The poison seeped into the wood slowly, over years. The fibers changed. They became brittle, dry. The wood didn't rot. It died from the inside out, remaining intact on the outside. Like a person who smiles while inside they're already empty. The ancestral tree was dying exactly like that. On the outside, the trunk stood. The bark held. The crown was green. But inside, the fibers were twisting. The sap was flowing the wrong way. The sylvare in the roots was weakening. And every 50 years, a new dose of poison entered through the nail that was supposed to heal it. Danny laid it all out at the council meeting. No accusations, no names. He said the tree was being poisoned, that the poison was being introduced through a sacrificial ritual, that the oil's formula had been altered 200 years ago, that there was a nail in the trunk that wouldn't dissolve, that this wasn't old age, not fate, not the will of the roots. It was poisoning. The hall fell silent. The silence was so thick that Danny could hear Kayla's heart beating next to him, heavy, deep, like a drum. Velkhori stood up. His face was calm. His smile was warm. He said the accusations were serious, that evidence was needed, that any ritualist could make a mistake in the recipe, that the nail could have been defective, that a stranger without sylvare in his blood could not understand the nature of the sacred ritual. He spoke softly, reasonably. Every word fell like a stone in water. Ripples spread out. The lords nodded, some of them. Danny stood on a stool, small, in an apron, with sawdust in his hair, facing a 3-meter-tall ritualist with 300 years of authority. He said one thing, that he was ready to prove it, right now. That he would pull the nail from the tree, that the council would see what it was made of, and that Tally Stonebird, the dwarf blacksmith, would identify the metal, because dwarves know metals as elves know trees. The hall buzzed. Velkhor's expression didn't change, but Danny saw it. A muscle in his cheek twitched. Once. The council voted. The majority voted in favor. Velkhor voted in favor, because voting against it would mean admitting he was afraid of the inspection. Extraction date, 2 days from now. 2 days. Danny worked. He prepared the extraction tool, thin, precise, like surgical tools, long-nosed pliers. Tally forged them herself, with her eyes closed, by touch. She said that for work like this, eyes get in the way, only hands. At night in the workshop, all 6 of them, the 3 princesses, Tally, Neri, and Danny. Kayla said Velkhor wouldn't wait, that he'd try to do something before the extraction, remove the nail, swap it out, or eliminate whoever found it. Security was doubled. 8 Red Guard sentinels at the workshop, 4 at the Sacred Grove. Morwen said she'd spend 2 nights at Dereva, in person. Kayla said she'd be with her. Iselin said she'd stay at the palace. She'd keep an eye on Velcori at the council. Danny slept in the workshop with Tally. Tally slept on the floor with a hammer within reach. She said that's how dwarves always sleep when in danger. Hammer within reach. An axe under the pillow. Brandy in the stomach. Danny didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling. He thought about how tomorrow he would be picking at the bark of a living god with 3 little pliers, and that the whole world depended on it. Not his world, their world. Warm roots pulsed beneath the floor, slowly, weakly. He placed his palm on the floor and said quietly, "Hold on, I'm coming." Extraction day, morning, gray. Even the light filtering through the treetops was dimmer than usual. As if Aelorian knew that something was being decided today. The Sacred Grove. All 3 of them. Iselin in white, Kayla in red, Morwen in black. The lords of the 3 houses. The guard, Velcor, and Danny. Little Danny, in an apron, with Tally's pliers in his hands. Tally beside him, with a hammer on her belt, and Neri with books and notes. Sherry Holt stood slightly to the side. Danny had noticed her that morning. She had come on her own, without an invitation. 5'7", a human, the only one besides Danny. She approached him before it began, looked him in the eyes, and said she wasn't here for the prophecy or the princesses. She was here because if a small person gets killed in a crowd of big ones, someone has to stand by with a crossbow. Danny looked at her. A crossbow really was slung across her back. A small one, human-sized. He asked where it was from. She said you could buy anything from the merchants if you knew who to ask. He nodded. She stood behind him. The approach to the tree. Danny led the way. The trunk rose like a wall. Silvery bark, moss, lichen, the smell of Swedish rot that everyone could now sense because Danny had explained that it wasn't the tree's scent, but the smell of its sickness. He approached the south side, got down on his knees, found a hollow. A nail stuck out 1/2 centimeter, black, damp, embedded in the bark. The bark around it was darker, drier, deader. Danny set the pliers on the bark next to the nail. His hands were steady. His hands are always steady when he works. They tremble before, they tremble after. While working, his hands know what to do. He picked up the pliers. The thin jaws gripped the head of the nail. Tightly, precisely. He pulled, slowly. The nail wouldn't budge. Embedded. Over 100 years, the bark had wrapped around it and held it fast. Danny pulled harder. His hands tensed. The muscles in his forearms bulged. The nail wouldn't budge. Kayla stepped forward. Danny shook his head. No, his hands had to do this. Human hands. Small. Weak. But precise. He changed the angle. Just a little. By 2 degrees. He turned the pliers. He pulled not toward himself, but to the side and upward. The nail shifted. A millimeter. Another millimeter. The bark creaked. Danny pulled. Sweat trickled down his temples. His hands burned, but they didn't tremble. The nail was coming out. Slowly, reluctantly, like a bad tooth. One last tug. The nail came out. With a squelching sound, like a cork from a bottle. Danny fell backward, sat down on the ground, held the nail and the pliers in front of him. Black, long, elbow length, with a spiral groove running its entire length. Damp, covered in something oily, smelling, that very smell. Swedish, dead. And at that moment, the tree exhaled. Not a metaphor, literally. Air flowed from the hole where the nail had been. Warm, damp, like breath, as if the tree had been holding its breath for 100 years and had finally let it out. The leaves above her head stirred, without a breeze. The roots beneath her feet quivered. The moss grew brighter, by a single shade, barely noticeable, but noticeable. Tally stepped closer. She picked up the nail, turned it over, sniffed it, scraped it with her fingernail, and said in a steady voice that it wasn't silver. It was a lead alloy, with an admixture of something she would identify later in the smithy. But she could recognize lead with her eyes closed. Lead, not silver, pure poison. The hall. No, the clearing. She was silent. Danny raised his head. Velcori stood 10 paces away. His face hadn't changed. Warm, kind, old-fashioned. But his hands hung limply at his sides, and his fingers trembled slightly. Morwen looked at him, straight on. For the first time in her life, she looked at her uncle not as a niece looks at a mentor, but as a judge looks at a defendant. Kayla stepped toward Velcori. Her hand rested on the hilt of the sword, that very one, with the hilt that Danny had carved, with indentations for her fingers, with a small K-shaped brand on the inside. Velcori raised his hand, calmly. He said it was a provocation, that a stranger had swapped the nail, that a human couldn't understand a sacred ritual, that the lead could have been replaced overnight. He spoke evenly, confidently. He had been preparing for this moment. Danny stood up, small, covered in mud, sweat on his face. He said there were 3 more nails in the trunk, over 200 years, 4 rituals, 4 nails. He found one, the rest at the same height, at human height, at a level no elf would look at, because to do that, you'd have to kneel before the tree, and elves don't do that. But he wasn't an elf. He circled the trunk in an hour, found the 2nd nail on the west side, the 3rd on the north, the 4th on the east, all at the same height, all black, all lead, all with the same oily poison. 4 nails, 4 corners of the world, 200 years of poison. Telly pulled out the 3 remaining ones. Danny couldn't take it anymore. His hands finally trembled. When the work was done, as always, he sat on the tree's root, a small man on the root of a god, and he watched as 4 black nails lay in a row on a piece of white cloth. Kayla stood before Velcor. 3 steps separated them. She was silent. Her hand gripped the hilt. Velcor was silent. For the first time in all the years Danny had known him, the kind old man's face cracked. Beneath it was another face, calm, cold, tired. He looked at Danny and said without a smile that a Lorien had to go with dignity, that great peoples do not cling to life with a carpenter's hands, that he had given the tree the dignity of departure, that every nail was an act of mercy. Morwen approached him, stood beside him, 26 centimeters. She said one word, his name, Velcor. He looked at her. She said that he had taught her to speak with dead trees, and that now she knew why they were dead. Velcori closed his eyes. The guards approached. Kayla nodded. They led him away, quietly, without a struggle. He walked tall, straight, 324. His back was straight, as if he were going not to prison, but for a walk. Danny sat on a tree stump. The tree pulsed beneath him, stronger than before, just a little, like a heart that had remembered why it beats. After Velcori Aelorian's arrest, everything froze. For 3 days, no one knew what to do. For 300 years, this elf had been the high ritualist. All the rites passed through his hands. The ancestors spoke through his voice. And he turned out to be a poisoner. Trust cracked, like the deck of a lute, but deeper. Danny didn't celebrate, he worked. Because pulling out the nails isn't a cure, it's stopping the bleeding. The wound remains. 200 years of poison in the wood. The lead spread through the fibers, deep, wide. Silver was poisoned to the roots. The young shoots grew thin and brittle. The bark cracked. The leaves faded more slowly after the nails were removed, but they faded. More was needed. Danny knew that. He knew it from the moment he touched the bark for the first time. His hands told him then. His mind caught up now. The tree didn't need to be cured. The tree needed to be restored. Not returned to the past, helped to grow into the future. Like a lute, like a violin. Not to plug the crack, to wedge it, to restore the tension, to give it new support. He assembled a team, not princesses, masters. Tally, Neri, the Sylvandir gardeners, the Tenevel ritualists, those who knew nothing of Velcorey's betrayal, who believed in the rites, the young, the angry, the lost, the blacksmiths of the Foothill Guild. Barg Ironfang personally sent the 5 best, with an anvil, with coal, with silver. Actually, Sherry brought 3 human merchants from the port. They knew herbs, knew oils, knew recipes the elves didn't know because they despised human knowledge. Danny stood before them, on a stool, as always, small, in an apron. He said the plan was simple. 3 stages. Stage 1, cleansing. Remove the poison from the bark. Cut away the poisoned layers. Where the bark is dead, remove it. Down to the living tissue, like a surgeon cuts away dead tissue. Stage 2, nourishment. New nails. Real ones. Silver. Made according to the original recipe, with oil that Neri had recreated from a 1,000-year-old text. 4 nails, 4 sides. But not like before. Not into the bark. Deeper. Into the cambium. Into the living layer, where the tree grows. Stage 3, support. Don't treat the roots. Give it new ones. Danny explained. When a violin cracks, you don't glue the crack back together. You insert a spring. A thin wooden strip that runs along the crack from the inside. It doesn't cover the wound. It gives the walls new support. So the wood can grow around the wound. Embrace it. Incorporate it. A tree needs springs. Not in the trunk, in the roots. Guides, channels of living wood that will carry healthy sap past the poisoned areas, like bypass channels around a blocked artery. The work took 2 weeks. Danny slept no more than 3 hours a day. Kayla carried him to the grove every morning, in her arms, because he refused to waste time walking up endless staircases. She carried him and grumbled that he weighed as much as a kitten and that at least kittens sleep. Iselin coordinated. Ambassadors, lords, supplies. She kept the 3 houses from falling out with one another while Danny worked. Without it, all would have fallen apart in a day. Morwen performed rituals, new ones, from old books. She stood before the tree and sang, quietly, softly. Her voice went down into the roots. Danny heard it through the tree, a vibration, like a tuning fork. Morwen gave the tree a rhythm, a pulse, so it would remember how to beat. Tally forged nails from pure silver. 4 of them. She made each one over the course of a day, without a break, 24 hours at the anvil. She forged the last nail with her eyes closed and sang a gnome song, low, humming, like the sound of the mountains. Neri stood by the tree with a book, translating the ancient symbols, pointing out where the cambium was still alive, where it could be cut, where it couldn't. Sherry stood guard, with a crossbow, because Velcor had been arrested, but his men hadn't. For 2 days, someone had been watching the grove from the shadows. Sherry noticed. She told Kayla. Kayla sent out scouts. They found 3, former Tenevel ritualists, fanatics, loyal to Velcor. They were taken quietly, without bloodshed. On the 14th day, Danny drove in the last nail. A silver one, real silver, into the cambium on the south side, where the first poisoned one had been. He struck with a small hammer, his own, a human one. The nail went in slowly. Silver is soft. The cambium is resilient. A blow, another blow, another. The nail went in. Danny placed his palm on the bark nearby and felt it. The pulse changed. It didn't get stronger. It became steadier, like a heart that had stopped stumbling. The tree accepted the nail. He stepped back, looked up. The bark around the nail was lightening, slowly. The silvery color was returning, like paint on a restored canvas. And above, high up, in the crown, a rustling sound. A leaf, one new, bright green. It appeared on a branch that had been considered dead for 20 years. One leaf, small, but alive. Kayla saw it first. She pointed upward. Everyone raised their heads. Silence. Then Morwen knelt before the tree. For the first time, an elf, before the tree, on her knees. Iselin followed her. Kayla followed her. The lords watched. Not all of them knelt, but many did. Danny stood, small, the only one who didn't kneel, because he didn't need to. He was already at eye level with what needed to be seen. That evening, the sacred grove was empty. The lords had left. The guards had retreated to the edge. 6 remained. Danny, Iselin, Kayla, Morwen, Tally, Neri, and Sherry, who stood a little further away, by a tree at the edge of the clearing, with a crossbow on her lap. Danny sat at the base of the tree, with his back to the trunk. The roots were warm. His pulse was steady, calm. For the first time in all the time he'd been feeling it, his pulse was calm. Kayla sat down beside him. The ground shook. She always sat down like that, as if she were falling, with her whole weight, with her whole being. She was silent for a minute. Then she said, "He'd done it." Danny shook his head. He said he hadn't done it. He'd fixed it. Those are different things. Kayla laughed, quietly, not like usual, not like thunder, quietly, as if she were saving the sound for him alone. She said he always said that. Iselin approached, 6 feet tall, a moon-white dress, silver eyes. She sat down on the other side, neatly, folded her legs. She placed her hands on her knees. She looked up at the canopy. Up there, a new leaf was glowing. She said she would convene the council of the new treaty in the morning. The 3 houses, the Foothill Guild, the human enclave, everyone at one table, at the very table that Danny had built. She said the treaty with the tree needed to be changed. The old treaty was about purity, about the elves taking silver from the tree and, in return, guarding it alone, without outsiders, without the lesser ones. The new treaty would be about something else, not roots down, roots out. Danny looked at her. She was smiling, just a little, as always. But there was something new in her eyes. Not weariness, not sadness. Something like dawn. Morwen stood in the shadow of the trunk, a dark figure against the backdrop of silvery bark. She was silent. Then she approached. She stood before Danny, just under 3 meters. She leaned down, low, lower still, to his face. Her black hair fell forward like a curtain, shielding them from the world. In the darkness of her hair, he could see only her eyes, dark, bottomless, warm, warm for the first time. She kissed him, on the lips, gently, like touching the first spring shoot, softly. Her lips were cool, then warm. Then she pulled away, stood up straight. Her hair slid back. The light returned. Kayla was watching. Not jealousy, not anger, something else. Acceptance. She reached out a hand, a huge one. It covered Danny's palm. He couldn't even see his own fingers beneath her hand. She said quietly, Baby, you're ours. Not mine, not hers, not Isolin's. Ours. Isolin placed her palm over Kayla's hand. 3 hands, 1 stack, huge, medium, small. Morwen hesitated. Then she knelt down beside them and placed her hand, the 4th. 4 hands on a single root of the ancestral tree. Danny sat, small, surrounded by 3 giants. His hand was at the very bottom, beneath 3 palms, warm, heavy, alive. He said he wanted to do something. Kayla asked what. He said he wanted to build a house, a small one, his size, inside the palace, with 3 big armchairs by the hearth, with a workshop next door, with a window into the treetops, and for the door to be normal height, so that at least one door in this world would be his height. Kayla laughed, loudly, as only she could. The forest echoed. She said there would be a door, and that she would have to bend down every time, and that she agreed to bend down for the rest of her life. Isolin said she would make a music room next door, where they could play in the evenings, on the lute he had repaired. Morwen said one word. Yes. Tally sat a little way off on a tree stump, smoking a pipe, watching them. Then she said that if they were done kissing and swearing eternal love, she needed 300 hinges by next week, because orders for folding chairs don't wait, and that she also needed some brandy. Neri sat next to Tally, a book on her lap. She smiled quietly. For the first time ever, she was sitting up straight, not slouching, not hiding. A little elf next to a dwarf, both shorter than is customary among their peoples, both in their rightful places. Sherry stood by the tree with a crossbow. She looked at Danny for a long time. Then she turned away, and Danny thought that this wasn't the end yet, that somewhere in a window of the Tinnavel Palace, a light was glowing. Someone was watching. Someone knew that Velcor wasn't alone. But that would come later. Later, there would be new enemies, new mysteries. Grandfather's chest in the secret room of Tinnavel. The very one he was transporting to a client on the night of his death. How did it get here? Why? Who moved it? These are the questions of the second arc. Now. Dark. The grove. Warm roots. 3 pairs of hands on top of his. The tree's pulse beneath his back. Calm. Steady. Alive. Stars were lighting up above the canopy. Unfamiliar. Strangers. Not a single constellation he knew. But beautiful. Danny Park sat at the foot of the god he had repaired, surrounded by 3 women, each of whom was twice his height, with a dwarf blacksmith who smoked red tobacco, an elven scholar who, for the first time, wasn't slouching, a human archer who stood guard and asked for nothing in return. He was a restorer, not a hero, not a warrior, not a mage, a craftsman who mended what was broken and made it stronger. A lute, a table, a chair, a sword, a comb, a casket, a tree. 3 hearts, one of his own. He looked at his hands, small, calloused, scarred, caked with dust. Hands that his grandfather had placed in his palms 20 years ago when he first gave him a chisel and said, "Listen to the wood. It knows better than you." Danny listened his whole life, and the wood had led him here. He closed his eyes. The roots pulsed, 3 breaths around him. Kayla's heavy and hot. Isolin's quiet and steady. Morwen's barely audible. Somewhere far away, Tally tapped her pipe against a root, knocking out the ash. Somewhere even further away in the city, elves were coming out into the streets and looking up at the crown of the tree, which was glowing, for the first time in 200 years, brightly, green, alive. All across Elorion, the leaves lit up at once, like thousands of green lanterns. The light spread in waves from the sacred grove to the farthest outskirts. The elves stood and watched, in silence. Some wept, some laughed. Children reached out their hands toward the light. The elderly sank to their knees. Somewhere in the smithy of the Mountain Guild, the dwarves stopped working and went outside. They looked up, for the first time, not at stone, but at leaves. In the human enclave, merchants opened their windows. Light flooded the streets. Green, soft, alive. The world was breathing again. Danny didn't see it. He was asleep. For the first time in 2 weeks, he was truly asleep. A small man at the foot of the enormous tree, covered by Isolin's cloak. The cloak reached down to his heels, like a blanket. Kayla sat beside him and didn't move, guarding his sleep. Morwen stood above them, a shadow among shadows, and she looked at him for a long time. Then she turned away and looked at the horizon, at the window of the Tenevel Palace, where a candle burned. Someone was watching. Someone understood that Velcor was the first, not the only one. Morwen placed her hand on the hilt of her dagger and spoke softly into the darkness. Try it. Sherry, nearby, cocked the bolt of her crossbow. Tally rested her hammer on her knees. Neri closed her book and stood up. 4 women around a single sleeping master. The tree shone above them. The roots beneath them pulsed, steadily, calmly, like a heart that remembers why it beats. Danny Park slept. And he dreamed of a workshop, not in Portland, here, with 3 chairs, with a hearth, with shavings on the floor, with the smell of fish glue and pine needles, with 3 voices, laughing, warm, and with a small door through which 3 giantesses would lean as they entered, every day, every evening, all his life. Home. His home.